Hello, I'm Adrianne Wojcik. The saddest dream that ever was. Matrimonial law reform in Victorian England and the Dickensian motif of a nuptial nightmare in 19th-century novel. Writing to Mrs. Lavinia Watson in July 1851, Dickens remarked, "What a dream we live in, until it seems for the moment the saddest dream that ever was dreamed." The letter itself does not explicitly refer to the novelist's views on marriage. However, Hard Times, Dickens's novel published shortly after in 1854, features a very sad, quote, long troubled dream, end quote, by Stephen Blackpool, in which his wedding turns into a funeral. Fascinated by the dread of Brother Grimm's fairy tales, which intertwined marriage and death, Dickens uses the motif of a nuptial nightmare and likely inspires other novelists to do so in order to indirectly advocate changes in marriage law around the passage of the Matrimonial Causes Act in 1857. Generally, until 1857, England had no judicial civil procedure for terminating marriages. Ecclesiastical courts granted separation from bed and board, which relieved a successful petitioner from engaging in the intimate and domestic obligations that typically come with marriage. But it did not allow for remarriage. The divorce from the bond of wedlock was a legal annulment that allowed remarriage. However, it was available only when marriage was ruled invalid as a result of insufficient age, mental incompetence, incest, or fraud. Such divorce required that a petitioner, typically a husband, first obtain separation from room and board in an ecclesiastical court, and then file a criminal conversation lawsuit against his adulterous wife's lover. If he won both lawsuits, then a member of parliament would have to sponsor a private bill of divorce, which could be granted only after rehearing of the evidence of the previous two trials. Therefore, Dickens frames his initial argument about divorce in Hard Times primarily in economic terms. Bounderby's descriptions of the complicated court system and the expense of pursuing divorce show that divorce is essentially unobtainable for the majority of the English society, especially the working class poor such as Stephen. In 1850, the Royal Commission on Divorce and Matrimonial Causes, chaired by Lord Campbell, Dickens's friend, attempted to make divorce simpler and cheaper by taking it out of the hands of the ecclesiastical courts and creating a new court for divorce and matrimonial causes. However, the grounds for divorce remained essentially unchanged. Both spouses had to prove adultery in order to divorce, with a wife additionally needing to prove that her husband also engaged in either desertion, cruelty, incest, bigamy, or practiced an unnatural vice such as sodomy or rape of another woman. The Matrimonial Causes Act, therefore, did not provide any remedies for spouses stuck in incompatible, loveless, and even emotionally or physically abusive marriages. Stephen's long troubled dream implies the need for more flexible divorce laws by depicting mismatched and loveless marriages as synonymous with emotional and in some cases even physical death. Stephen dreams about marrying a woman he doesn't know. The wedding ceremony, veiled in darkness, includes many dead witnesses. The initial darkness temporarily changes into light, which highlights some mysterious, hard to decipher words, quote, in fiery letters, unquote. This morbid drama features Stephen in the role of a helpless husband in an awful marriage that metaphorically destroys any life within him. He has no choice but to participate in this dreadful show and at the same time watches it in fear. Stephen was, quote, on a raised stage under his own look, and hearing the burial service distinctly read, he knew that he was there to suffer death, end quote. Here, Dickens appropriates the theatrical and surreal nature of a dream to insert sensationalism into a realist novel. as the third-party narrator unfolds the horror of Stephen's wedding turning into a funeral. Such a narrative technique effectively presents some of Dickens's more radical arguments against inflexible marriage law to his conservative audience by helping them imagine what some of them did not dare to say out loud, namely, that a horrible marriage can metaphorically kill a spouse. But Dickens's argument extends beyond the metaphor. In his frustration with the law, Stephen actually says that the legal prohibition to be, quote, unchained from one another, end quote, makes people, quote, battle and murder, end quote. After all, even Stephen, the paragon of virtue, would let his wife drink poison as he wakes up from his nuptial nightmare, had not the angelic Rachel prevented it. Dickens denies the readers a happy ending a la Jane Eyre, where the terrible wife simply dies, allowing Stephen and Rachel to marry and live happily ever after. But this dramatic scene explains why the law is a muddle, as the novel famously characterizes it. Not only is it extremely complicated and costly to divorce, but the lack of legal remedies in unhappy and emotionally abusive marriages leads to desperation, which may breed immorality. Framing his argument about marriage as a nightmare, Dickens evokes many Brother Grimm's fairy tales, which also feature dark and morbid descriptions of weddings and marriages. Published between 1812 and 1814, Grimm's fairy tales were popular in England, and we know that Dickens had read them. Elaine Ostry reminds us in her book, Social Dreaming, Dickens and the Fairy Tale, that many Victorians didn't think of the fairy tale as childish. Instead, they rather viewed it as, quote, promoting the imagination and fancy in a materialistic utilitarian world, end quote. Perhaps the dark themes of these German folk tales stirred Dickens's own imagination, helping him find compelling and creative ways to depict the sinister aspect of a marriage bond in a realist novel. One Grimm's fairy tale in particular, The Robber Bridegroom, uses a dream to reveal the truth about a terrible spouse in ways similar to Hard Times. When a miller's daughter goes to visit her fiancé's house in a dark forest, an old woman tells her that the fiancé will kill and eat her unless she hides. In hiding, the girl indeed learns that her fiancé belongs to a band of robbers who kill and prepare to eat another young woman. When one robber chops off the victim's finger to get at the golden ring on it, the finger and the ring land in the hiding girl's lap. She eventually escapes this house of horrors, but when her wedding day arrives, she tells everyone about what she had seen. As she recounts the grisly details of her husband's murder, she turns to him in between each sentence, saying, "This was only a dream, my love." Presenting the horrific truth about her husband in the form of a dream allows the bride to openly discuss it with a larger audience at her wedding, much in a way that Dickens uses a dream to compare Stephen's marriage to death. However, while the fairy tale has a happy ending, the bride eventually produces the dead woman's finger as evidence, which, quote, delivers her husband over to justice, end quote. Stephen's nuptial nightmare merely reflects the sad reality of his suffocating marriage, which no system of justice can remedy. While in Hard Times, Dickens sensationalizes the dangers of bad marriage only under the guise of a dream, Wilkie Collins bases the entire plot of his 1859 novel, The Woman in White, on sensation. An evil and greedy husband, Sir Percival, uses the astonishing resemblance of his wife Laura to another terminally ill woman, in order to stage his wife's untimely death and inherit her fortune. Although seemingly very different than Hard Times, The Woman in White also utilizes the motif of a nuptial nightmare as a clue to Sir Percival's sinister plan. Lauren's sister, Marianne, intercepts an anonymous letter which describes a dream about Laura's wedding. The letter writer watches Laura walk down the aisle in her white dress. Unlike Stephen's dream, which starts in darkness, here the wedding chapel is filled with rays of light, highlighting the seeming brightness of this blissful occasion. However, as soon as the rays of light touch the groom's chest, they expose the repelling darkness of his heart, which now makes the dream resemble the morbid character of Stephen's nightmare. The author of the mysterious letter writes, "I looked along the two rays of light, and I saw down into his inmost heart. It was black as night, and on it were written in the red flaming letters, which are the handwriting of the fallen angel, 'He will live to strew with misery the path of this woman by his side.'" The flaming letters closely resemble the fiery letters in Stephen's nightmare, though here the message is clear. Although in this dream, Laura's wedding does not turn into a funeral, as in Stephen's case, the wedding still ends abruptly, as the highly disturbed clergyman cannot even find the marriage service in his prayer book. Therefore, Collins seems to partly appropriate Stephen's nuptial nightmare, but he also rewrites this motif in a way more analogous to the robber bridegroom, because Marianne's knowledge of the dream arises her suspicions of Sir Percival and leads her to spy on him, which eventually brings him to justice. As such, the nuptial nightmare in Collins serves as a narrative device that propels the plot of the novel and leads to a happy ending. However, like Dickens, Collins also uses the nightmare as a form of truth that exposes the fiction of the law, which falsely assumes that Sir Percival will protect Laura in marriage as a husband ought to protect a wife, when in fact he deceives and almost kills her. We find another echo of Stephen's nuptial nightmare in George Eliot's 1863 historical novel, Romola, where a main character, Tito Malema, engages in a de facto bigamy with two women, Tessa and Romola. Eliot never describes Romola's actual wedding to Tito, but she offers a menacing vision of such a wedding in the prophecy of Fra Luca, a Dominican friar and Romola's brother. Dying, Fra Luca tells Romola of his vision of her wedding to a mysterious stranger, the man with a blank face, who reminds us of the unknown bride that Stephen was about to marry in his nightmare. The images of Fra Luca's vision, however, are even darker than Stephen's nightmare. Here, the priest who marries Romola has the face of death, and her wedding procession consists of the dead who step out of their open graves. At last, Romola arrives at some desolate place where there's no water and no trees or herbage. Her father falls to the ground begging for water. The members of her wedding procession mock her, and her groom is finally unmasked as, quote, the great tempter, end quote. The apocalyptic character of Fra Luca's strange vision is so disturbing that Romola at first dismisses it as a, quote, sickly fancy, end quote. We could almost hear her say to her brother, "It is just a dream, my love," as the robber bride said to her wedding guests in the Grimm's fairy tale. However, Romola remains deeply distressed by the vision and remembers it on her engagement day when she sees one of the masked processions featuring ghastly image of death as the winged hourglass. In time, Romola understands her tragic mistake of marrying the dishonest Tito and even attempts to escape him, though eventually her moral and religious convictions cause her to return to her husband in honor of her marriage vows. Still, the happy ending of the novel, in which Tito's sudden death frees Romola from their legal but inauthentic marriage, implies Eliot's agreement with Dickens that inflexible marriage law fails to provide any adequate remedies in the many cases of marital fraud and abuse. The inextricable link between marriage and death, which frames Stephen's nuptial nightmare, also permeates Madame Bovary, Gustave Flaubert's 1856 masterpiece of French realist literature. Given the French repealed their 1792 Divorce Act in 1816 and regarded divorce as a revolutionary concept throughout most of the 19th century, it's plausible that, like Hard Times, Madame Bovary at least implicitly criticizes contemporaneous marriage law by illustrating the tragedy of legally binding people in mismatched and incompatible marriages. Although the novel does not feature one specific dream or vision which would closely resemble Stephen's nuptial nightmare, it utilizes dreams to connect death and marriage. Emma's obsession with romanticizing death is a contributing factor to both her and her husband's untimely demises. For example, she imagines the beauty of dying swans and fantasizes about her own death upon seeing the bridal bouquet of Charles's first, now deceased wife. Given she continually idealizes death, in time she almost inures to it, treating it as a mere theatrical act. One moment she's ready to throw herself out of the window after some romantic disappointment just to sit at the dinner table and pretend to be a happy wife minutes later. In one of the more disturbing passages in the novel, we read that it was, quote, domestic mediocrity that drove Emma to lewd fancies, and marriage tenderness that caused her adulterous desires, end quote. If so, then Dickens was perhaps right that mismatched marriages actually breed immorality, as Stephen says in Hard Times, though Flaubert certainly redefines what constitutes a bad marriage, given that Charles is essentially a good husband. Even Emma herself says she, quote, would have liked Charles to beat her, that she might have a better right to hate him, to revenge herself upon him, end quote. It is stunning that Emma fantasizes about and longs for the theatricality of physical abuse, believing that such abuse would make her feel more alive than the suffocating monotony of her boring and ordinary marriage. And yet, while Emma's position in the matter indicates her immaturity and a distorted sense of reality, it also reminds us of the Dickensian view that marital unhappiness can be seriously tragic and even dangerous. In conclusion, I am not proposing that any of the authors discussed today openly advocated for divorce. However, the menacing echoes of Stephen Blackpool's nuptial nightmare resound in various 19th century novels written around the same time as Hard Time, serving as literary warnings against excessive inflexibility of Victorian marriage laws. These echoes suggest that marital incompatibility, as well as emotional abuse, are not mere inconveniences that most Victorians should have been expected to suffer, but rather more serious concerns which ought to be discussed in the legal debates on divorce. Thank you.